but welcome everyone who is joining. My name is Sabrina Merlot, and I'm local response lead at Open Source Medical Supplies. And we're, excited to gather today to have a conversation and some presentation on sustainable business practices for producing medical supplies. We've got some more folks joining, but I do want to get into introducing our panelists, our esteemed panelists. We have Open Source Medical Supplies founder, Gui Cavalcanti, who is also well known for his role as executive director at Artisan's Asylum. Founder, co-founder, how do you say that, Gui?
Co-founder at Artisan's Asylum.
One of the largest makerspaces in the United States, based in Somerville, Massachusetts. Gui also executive director of a robotics startup called Breeze. Maybe that's a CEO level, isn't it, Gui? And then also taught a class on business practices and business management at Olin, which is where we started having a conversation about this and what is happening across the maker community in the production of PPE. And we thought that work was applicable for this discussion. We also have Will Holman, executive director at OpenWorks Baltimore, a leading makerspace there, who has been doing a lot of work in this PPE production moment, doing a great job of marrying mission-centered work of a nonprofit with, in a way, a business approach to PPE production. So that is our setup today for our participants. And I am going to let Gui go ahead and take it away.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Sabrina, for setting this up. My name is Gui Cavalcanti. I'm going to share my screen for a worksheet that we've been working on here. Great. Can everybody see that?
Yep.
So yeah, welcome everybody. So I wanted to take a minute to talk about how makerspaces can think about integrating medical supply production in their business models. And Will has done an amazing job in Baltimore of doing this. And we know of a couple of other groups around the country that are doing it because, for makerspaces around the world, this is an incredibly challenging time, right? Traditional revenue streams are breaking in a lot of ways because, hey, gathering indoors is suddenly a big deal, right? And it's suddenly a hard thing to do. And kind of on top of that, there's a lot of need in the community that is not necessarily just social, right? There's a very significant need for just taking care of each other. That, makerspaces can be a fun, extra activity in your day. And there isn't as much time for fun extra activities in your day these days. So wanted to take a minute, think about how to best conceptualize this and introduce y'all to a few ideas. So, really trying to focus on what are some ideas of how you can include medical supply production sustainably in your space? What are some ideas around how to reopen your space in this pandemic? And we'll talk about all of that today. But this worksheet itself is linked in the chat, and we can send out a broader link later. We also are working on a spreadsheet that goes along with it. This is in the same vein as how to make a makerspace worksheet that Artisan's Asylum put together a number of years ago, myself and Molly Rubenstein working with Make to publish that. And the idea here is that we're trying to get people to think through all of the potential ways in which these supply production processes could impact your space. So first step in my mind is understanding what it costs to run your space, to create these supplies, and building out that model. Because if you don't have an understanding of that, then you don't understand how, you know, retooling your space or how producing these supplies could affect things. So, you know, we can go into the details later, but essentially the biggest first step that I want you all to think about is categorizing all of your expenses in a way that compares apples to apples, right? A lot of you have these big yearly payments for insurance. A lot of you have utilities. A lot of you have rents, right? And you have sometimes paid staff. You have often, you know, supplies for volunteers like pizza, drinks, right? Anything necessary to keep a volunteer production run going. And how do you pull that all into one cohesive look at how much money you're spending so that you don't bankrupt yourselves making these supplies, right? Like key here. And so what this worksheet is trying to do is surface all of these different expenses that you might have and turn them into a model that includes both keeping the doors open, regardless of whether anyone's working in your space or not, and understanding the kind of per unit cost of making a thing. And then towards the end, we talk about how you might integrate something sustainably into your plan. So, you know, starting off with the easiest ones to think about, most of you know your monthly rent, I would assume. Most of you know any other monthly cost like common area maintenance or things like that you might know your landlord. Minimum monthly utility payments or regular utility payments if you're still open, your monthly or yearly insurance payments and taxes and all of that kind of thing, and then any sort of subscriptions that are necessary to keep your space open, right? Like these are all expenses that I would imagine you all have a pretty good handle on. The things that are less, you know, easy to keep a handle on are volunteer costs, variable staff costs. So a lot of you are used to a world in which your staff are, you know, making programming, right? They're paying for themselves with classes or memberships in the space or things like that, right? And if you're devoting a lot of time to supply production, then a lot of these staff costs may need to be supported by supply production, right? And so there's some questions here, right? Like, what are your staff's payrolls if you have them? What are the payroll taxes? What are the benefits? Do you have utilities that scale with staff, right? Do you have AC costs that scale with staff? Do you have electricity or other costs that scale with staff? If you can't necessarily afford right now your full staff's payroll, are there basic expenses that you can cover, right, through supply production or other? These are all conversations, hard conversations that I imagine everyone's having right now. But, you know, it's important to kind of understand that we're in this race together and that it is a marathon, not a sprint, right? So even if you can't necessarily cover the full payroll you might be used to, are there minimum expenses per staff that you can cover to keep people paying rent, paying groceries, things like that? And what money are you spending on volunteers, right? Volunteers are not free. Volunteers are people. They need food, they need drinks, they need to be celebrated, they need, you know, all of these other elements to their work. And often, in the case of this pandemic, you need infrastructure that doesn't exist, right? Like folding tables, table covers, PPE for your own volunteers, right? All of that kind of stuff. What are the costs of that? And then once you get into that, you get into the very real variable costs of production. What is the variable cost of goods to make your supplies that you are making right now? And it's really important to note that it's not just raw materials, right? It's, hey, do you need to replace your laser tube after making a certain number of face shields? Do you need to pay for shipping for that big 4x8 worth of plastic to come to your shop? Do you need to pay for delivery to get all of your items out? Do you need to pay for packaging? Do you need to pay for ink cartridges because you're printing so many labels that you're including in your little baggies? Do you need to pay for the baggies, right? All of these are costs, and all of them break down into costs per unit of things shipped, right? It's, you know, raw material, it's waste of raw material, it's shipping your raw material, it's wear and tear on your tools, right? Which may just turn into a, hey, I need to get a new printer after I've done 1,000 face shields, right? It's packaging and labeling, it's delivery, and it's, you know, the per staff or per unit consideration of how much it costs to make a thing. If you have a staff member producing face shields, how many minutes does it take for them to assemble a face shield? You can think of their salary not as a monthly expense, but as a variable cost. And I know, Will, you did that in your spreadsheet, and I'd love to talk about that decision-making process. One thing I always really love to do is think about how wrong I am, right? So even after you go through this process of saying, hey, I think this costs this much, this costs this much, this costs this much, this is how much I expect it to cost total, there's also this factor of you don't know everything. You don't know how much everything's going to cost, whether you like it or not. And there's a important bit here of identifying how wrong you've been before, how wrong you usually are, or how wrong you expect to be when you are thinking about these expenses. Do you want to add 25% to your expenses? Do you want to double your expenses because you think you are so wrong that you might need that buffer? The goal here is to kind of identify a safe percentage that takes into account weird freak accidents. Is your laser cutter going to catch on fire because you've been running it so long? Do you need maintenance for these tools? Do you need a new tool, right? What can't you necessarily predict? And then, you know, past that, the goal here is to create a flexible model in your spreadsheet where you can tweak all of these dials to make a sustainable, robust, like set of expenses that you can use to inform how much you should be charging for the supplies that you're making. And when I say you should be charging, I don't necessarily mean to a customer, because a lot of you really want to be able to donate these things. But you can consider charging, in this case, how much do you ask for in a fundraiser? How much do you ask for from a grant, from somebody like Get Us BBE or a local government or a granting organization, right? You should be able to come up with a number that is an accurate representation of what it takes you to produce these things, so that you can give that number plus the amount that you are wrong, plus profit for yourselves in order to save money past, you know, just paying your own expenses. So that's why you're making this. That's why you're building this model in the first place. So I want to pause for a second. I saw we had a question. Are there questions so far about building an expense model, answering these questions, putting them into a spreadsheet? Because the next part is, how do you integrate this into your business model? No open questions. Oh, yes, the doc is available. Okay, no questions yet. So, next up, I want to talk about integrating supply production into your business models. And I want to just straight up say, makerspaces are not manufacturers, right? Like, you did not start your makerspace to become a local manufacturer, or at least I'm assuming that the vast majority of you didn't. Competing with local manufacturers is extremely hard, right? They are designed from start to finish to make things quickly and efficiently. You are not, right? Makerspaces are prototyping shops. They're not production shops. They often have a huge variety of tools that have, you know, more or less capacity, but they're not geared to make things over 3 shifts continuously, you know, and pay people appropriately for that. Another thing that they're good at, though, is they're good at training people on how to make things. They're good at building capacity within a community for making things. Makerspaces are also a community center, right? They're third spaces. They're not home. They're not work necessarily for your community. They're social gathering places. And that's actually really, really critical right now, right? Under months of shelter-in-place orders, people have been deprived of community, and they are looking for that community now in ways that they don't even know they need, right? Online interactions aren't enough, right? Makerspaces are common gathering points for large communities, and people want that social connection, right? And it's important to understand throughout all of this, what you are trying to do is reinforce your community. You are trying to gather your community, give them purpose. Even when it's not a pandemic, you as a makerspace are trying to encourage your community in various ways to support itself, and to celebrate the act of creation. So, I think it's really important to understand the things that makerspaces are good at and what they're not good at, right? And that means that makerspaces are positioned to act immediately to support their local communities, to create production runs of things, and to build capacity within their communities. They're not necessarily great at making mass quantities of things long term, and that's okay. That's not what they're made for. But there is an opportunity here to actually pull in production as part of your business model in a way that is helpful. And so I went through, and I have a couple of ideas here that I want to present just to get people out of reactive crisis brain and into proactive brain a little bit. So, what could you imagine doing with medical supply production in the long run? Well, first of all, you can think about budget shortfalls, right? So I can only imagine how many members have said, hey, I can't be in a space right now. I need to cut costs, right? I need to take my stuff out of the space. I'm sorry, but I can't afford this right now. I can only imagine, classes, traditional class sources of income, being less effective, right? People don't necessarily have the discretionary income that they are used to having that is used often to create the revenue of makerspaces. So you could think of supply production as a way of addressing those budget shortfalls if you can sell your supplies for more than it costs to make them. So that's one thing. Another big element of this is giving your members purpose, right? Community projects bring communities together. People, again, want that social mission right now. A lot of them want purpose in their lives. A lot of them want to volunteer their time and do something. Right now, the real unemployment rate in the US is around 30% in terms of people who literally don't have things to do right now. A lot of people are furloughed and may be expecting to go back to work, but haven't been called back to work yet. A lot of people are actually just unemployed. And those businesses to employ them aren't coming back necessarily as quickly as we want them to be across the US and the world. And volunteering in this capacity or working in this capacity can give people a lot of purpose, and can bring communities together. Another one, and this is something that we did really often at the Asylum, is supply production can actually help teach people how to use the tools in your space. So almost all of you, I expect, have some sort of training in the tools in your space, right? Whether it's how to use a sewing machine, how to use a laser cutter, how to do this, that, and the other thing. These are all elements of what makerspaces typically do. You can integrate PPE production into these classes, right? If you're looking for a way to produce things that fits into your business model, having your intro to sewing class be intro to making cloth masks for a few months, having your laser cutter training class be laser cutting face shields for a few months, right? These are all potential ways that you can integrate supply production into your usual course of business. And the great part about this is that if students are paying you to take these classes in the first place and learn these tools, now you're getting paid to produce PPE, which is another way of structuring this. You can also think about this as a way to harden your own space, right? You need your own set of masks, your own set of face shields, your own set of PPE for your own space, right? You can turn your production inwards and beef out your capacity, right? Give all of your members masks, right, through the volunteer process. You can also think this is branding, right? Like if you have a big cloth banner over your face, there's no reason it can't have your logo on it, right? There's no reason that like your face shields don't have, a little vinyl print of your logo or whatever, which leads me to this kind of last concept here of like, your makerspaces are often surrounded by local businesses. Those local businesses need supplies. Selling to those local businesses is a lot easier than attempting to sell to individuals, to consumers, right? Facebook is doing a lot of things about shutting down, new PPE ads, and rightly so, because there are a lot of manufacturers out there that are trying to take advantage of the issues that exist right now, and the needing of cloth masks, the needing of other PPE. But you walking down the street to your local bar and saying, hey, do you guys need branded cloth masks for your, bartenders or your servers? Or going to your community center and saying, hey, do you need like dividers for your space? Can we build them for you? Right? These are actually great ways for you to build resilience into your community in ways that people are looking for right now and don't necessarily know where to turn. And makerspaces have the advantage of, hey, your volunteers may be willing to volunteer their time to create things for the makerspace to sell, to help build out revenue and get yourselves on sustainable footing, right? These are all the superpowers makerspaces tend to have. So you can turn this into a social good mission of preparing your communities to, survive through this pandemic, and get everybody on the same page of, not necessarily turning yourselves into a manufacturing shop, but turning yourselves into a very, very agile community support system that can go around to all of your local businesses and create connections that aren't necessarily there. So I wanted to kick things off, get people thinking about that stuff, and then I want to take some questions and then switch gears and talk to Will about everything that OpenWorks has done in an amazing fashion. So I'm gonna check the chat, unless we have a few. Let's see. Are there any explicit questions right now? Let's see, I stop screen share. How to support other countries for open source medical supplies? That's a good question. I think, right now there are areas where there's a dire need of supplies. I think, for example, OSMS Taiwan shipping to Afghanistan is a great use of that. I don't know that we have an explicit view into exactly who needs the most supplies and where, but I think generally speaking, I am in full support of groups here continuing to produce and sending it to areas that need it. I know, for example, Navajo nations and other tribes in the U.S. desperately need supplies that they're having a lot of trouble sourcing. I know that there are a lot of groups across the U.S. and globally that can't support their own demand in their cities. And one of the things that we want to work on is a way of making those connections. Okay, let's pause on questions for now. So, Will, I would love to hear what you all have done. Can you tell us a story about how OpenWorks started responding to this? Like, what was the introduction to making medical supplies for you all?
Sure. So first off, thanks so much to the Open Source Medical Supply team for inviting me on today and helping OpenWorks represent in this forum. Just a quick background on OpenWorks. You can check out our website at www.openworksbemore.org. We've been around about 3.5 years. We modeled a lot of our practices after Artisan's Asylum. In fact, we were built from scratch. We offer 5 core services under the umbrella mission of making tools, technology, and the knowledge to use them accessible to all. So we have studio rentals, education for both young people and adults. We have contract services, so we can make things for you. We have membership, and we have event rentals. And then about 50% of our budget is grant funded, and we provide a whole bunch of community services for seniors, for young people, job training, etc. So under normal circumstances, OpenWorks is a pretty bustling place that has at least 1,000 people in and out of it every month. On March 16th, we were shut down by government order, and by that Friday, I had to furlough all of our part-time staff, so our shop technicians and some of our education staff. So that left us with the 6 full-time folks. That's kind of the core staff. During that same week, I've been receiving inquiries about pivoting to produce open source designs of various masks and face shield equipment. And I kind of homed in on the Prusa face shield design because we had the equipment to do that readily accessible. And I already knew plenty of local manufacturers that were heading in the mask direction. So I reached out to some healthcare providers and other local partners, and then posted on social media the Saturday after we were closed, calling all 3D printers. We only had 12 3D printers, so that was going to be a bottleneck for us to set up making that design. Excuse the pun, it went viral kind of in local media and on social media. By the end of the weekend, we had signed up about 250 volunteer printers, mostly in Maryland, but some kind of distributed. So we engaged with a group called We the Builders, which some of you may be familiar with. Under normal circumstances, they do crowdsourced 3D printed art projects. They've been at Maker Faire, I don't know, the last 6-8 years with some really cool sculptures. So they have a great part tracking system. You can check them out at wethebuilders.com. So they let us use their platform to start tracking this ad hoc like volunteer network that was growing up. And then we engaged with one of our members, Innovation Works, which is a business incubator for social enterprises, to help us with the distribution side, because through their board of directors and network, they had contacts with a lot of local hospitals. So we announced this idea publicly on Saturday, and we shipped our first box of face shields the following Wednesday. Nice. And to Guy's point, like the ability to pivot extraordinarily quickly and the flexible digitally enabled tooling that most makerspaces have, it may not be the most efficient way to mass manufacture things, but it's 10 times faster than setting up, you know, a giant die cutting factory or what have you. So we wrapped up production, at least for now, fingers crossed, last Friday, and we produced 28,270 face shields. We have parts for about 4,500 more that we've collected, but press the pause button on. About 18,000 of those were the crowdsourced parts, and about, no, take that back, 16,000. About 12,000 were ones that we produced in-house on our CNC, and I can get to that in a minute, but that's a design that we came up with. We distributed them to over 100 clients locally and some government agencies. And we worked over 56 production days. So we set up shifts, we hired people, hired some of our furloughed staff back, and kind of set up a very, you know, regular working schedule. And then we ended up with 388 volunteer printers. Many of them had access to more than one printer, like we had several school systems and library systems in the state of Maryland sign up. So that represented a printer base of roughly, it's a little hard to quantify, but around 1,200 printers. So we were able to basically scale our manufacturing base 10x, 100x. Math isn't my strong suit. 100x, so that we had this avalanche of parts coming in, and then we laser cut the visor pieces. We cut and fabricated the elastic. We sanitized the parts in a UV box. We assembled, cleaned, packaged, and distributed. So we kind of stood in the middle of the supply chain that we, the builders, helped us with, and the distribution network that Innovation Works helped us with. And then we were kind of the production manufacturing node in the center.
That's awesome. So what is happening now? Are you switching back to the makerspace business model? Are you reopening? What's your thoughts on current pandemic stuff?
Yeah, so the state of Maryland has started opening back up, but the city of Baltimore is still in a phase 1 lockdown, and so we are not allowed to reopen. However, we anticipate kind of the way things are trending that'll happen in the next week or two. So part of the reason we shut down production last Friday is we shipped our last big order to the USDA for their meatpacking plant inspection workforce. We sent them 14,000, so roughly half of our total production went to them. And now we have to fabricate a bunch of things to ready our space for reopening. And then, Guy, as you said, we've started working with other businesses to look into fabricating sneeze guards. We just prototyped a hand sanitizer dispenser station that we made on the CNC for a local brewery that had pivoted to making hand sanitizer. And then I had to sign an NDA for this, but we were doing some highly precise micro manufacturing for some medical research around COVID that hopefully I'll be able to talk about at some point.
And to be clear, you were already set up for contract manufacturing because that's part of your business model already.
Right. So we have a contract shop that's centered around a large Laguna Smart Shop router with a tool changer and some other toys. We've been using it as a platform for job training. So in 2019, we had 8 high school interns over the course of the year that got to work in that shop. And we do small to medium run manufacturing, mostly furniture, signage, jobs that are too big for our members and too small for a factory, I guess would be kind of our sweet spot. We make furniture for a national retailer called Room and Board, for instance, one of our steady clients, and we do a lot of local fabrication of items. So we already had product liability insurance, which I know is a question that's come up in these discussions a lot. In addition to our contract router, we have 3 full-size routers for our members, and we have 4 large format laser cutters and a 5th on the way. So like we already had a pretty large equipment base compared to a lot of spaces, which positioned us well to kind of rapidly scale up.
Awesome. Would you be willing to walk us through your spreadsheet?
Yeah, totally.
So, and I want to just say before that, you charged for your equipment. Is that?
We did, right? And so this became, in full transparency, a matter of some discontent among some of our volunteer base on the Slack channel we set up for builders. We were transparent from day one that we would be selling these at cost. Most people on this call, if you're involved in a makerspace, you probably know that most makerspaces, no matter how diverse and sustainable their business model, are kind of on the knife's edge of sustainability under the best of times, right?
Yep.
And so our intent from day one is that we were going into this for the right reasons, for a mission-driven reason, to serve our community. But at the very least, we have to hold ourselves financially harmless for this. We can't dig ourselves into a hole when all of our revenue evaporated overnight by government order. We can't dig ourselves further in a hole to supply hospital systems and government agencies that have plenty of money but no supply of the items in question. What we did commit to is charging a basically at cost, like I said, so that we could counteract price gouging in the marketplace, which was already rampant by the time we kind of got our portal together. And so that we could hire and pay people working. And by taking them on as employees, we could cover them under our workman's comp and liability insurance. I think this is a point that's not made enough here. Volunteers are wonderful. You can have them sign waivers, but God forbid somebody got sick at your facility handling a contaminated part sent in by a volunteer or something. You need to have some protections in place for those folks. So we thought all those things were important. And so we charge $6.50 for a regular 3D printed face shield and $7.75 for our hard hat mounted face shield that the USDA got from us.
That's great. And let's walk through that model real quick. I'd love to ask you a couple questions about that if you're willing to share.
Sure. If I don't believe I'm a host.
I can share my screen and we can.
I had dropped it into the chat. Let me see if I can pull it up. Just a second.
I have it up on mine.
All right, got it. So I guess I'll just kind of walk through the top. We already had some experience doing this because, again, we run a contract shop already. One of the first things we did, even before we got into the project at large, was secure the biggest order of PET G that we could find for the visors. So we had enough money in the bank to buy about $8,000 or $9,000 of that before the prices kind of all got jacked. And that stuff has been really hard to source since. So the 3D printed headband we based on kind of economy filaments based on what we charge for filament at OpenWorks for members to print. And we put all that in there to develop a reward system for volunteer printers. You can think of it as a sort of reverse Kickstarter. Since we were trying to launch this so quickly, we didn't have time to come up with it at the beginning, but over the next couple of weeks, our volunteers will be receiving reward packages based on how many parts they printed for us, which we were able to quantify with the We the Builders platform. So they'll be getting Matter Hackers gift cards, posters, t-shirts, stickers, and some other fun stuff, including some day pass to come back and visit us. So when you see the cost of the printed headbands, Ziplocs, gas, overhead calculation, etc., we set aside $1.40 from each unit to pay for all these rewards down the road, essentially. The rest are pretty straightforward materials. We put in some rough overhead calculations, office supplies. We had to print a spec sheet and drop it into each box. For instance, we have a copier at OpenWorks. We printed thousands and thousands of spec sheets. We just put in $0.01 each for the copies, for instance. Decontamination supplies. When we first started, we were using alcohol to disinfect parts that were submitted to us because we didn't know under what conditions those had been made. After the first 2 weeks, some friends of ours at Maryland Institute College of Art built a UV oven unit for us. And then we didn't have to buy all this alcohol and stuff, but we still needed gloves and other equipment to keep our workers safe. We worked in full PPE the whole time.
Right.
And then the labor, to Guy's earlier point, we popped in.
I want to just highlight that, so this is all of your fixed costs for a single unit, right? You've made all of your costs focus on a unit, and you say,
correct. Hey,
the raw materials costs us $2.26 to make a single face shield of this particular kind.
Correct.
Right? Yep. And so now you're moving on to different costs that are more variable, right? And this is labor costs for each unit.
So we knew from the get-go we weren't going to be able to cover our full-time payroll under this project. but we had applied for a PPP loan, and we were applying for other kind of grants in the Baltimore philanthropic community to try and cover our full-time payroll and some of our greater overhead costs. We also cut back on dumpster service and a bunch of other stuff that we normally pay in a month to try and reduce our costs. So we really kept the overhead in this calculation is artificially depressed from the system that Guy laid out in the Google Doc. As to labor, we base this on a $16 an hour cost. It's a little higher than we normally pay our techs, about $1 more, but we put that extra dollar in as a sort of hazard pay because we were asking people to kind of come out of quarantine to work with us. The minutes per part got refined as time went on. When we were first putting it together and we didn't have a good workflow set up in the building, it was slower. We ended up at an average production rate of about 500 units a day. Our peak day was 845 units, and some of our slower days were only 100 or 200 because a laser went down or we had some other supply hiccup. Elastic was persistently hard to get a hold of, and we'd run out of elastic and not be able to box items that day. So then the overhead, as I mentioned, is kind of a fractional allocation. The rest of it is covered through grants that we've been fortunate to raise because we got some attention around this project. And I was very clear with kind of the grant folks that like, you're not paying for face shields. Like, the individual units are kind of a break-even proposition. What we do need help with is paying our rent and some of the other costs that are enabling us to do this right now. And then down here, we did 10% set aside for partner costs. What that means is Innovation Works, We the Builders, Prussia Labs, all those folks will be kicking back. You know, we set aside 10% of the total amount that we made. And because these partners have helped facilitate this whole project, we're making donations back to all of them. Then sales tax, most of our clients were tax exempt, but not all. So our accountant's advice was to charge everyone sales tax up front, and you can refund them on the back end once they submit a sales exempt certificate, tax exempt certificate. And then the last is the credit card processing fee has to be calculated on all the costs above. It has to be calculated last because in the quick sales portal that Innovation Works set up through Squarespace, 3% goes back to the credit card on the total price. So as you can see, it came out a little higher than we ended up charging. Our initial cost estimate was $642, but we went back and tweaked a couple things about halfway through based on the real cost of filament and PETG, and then the incremental cost crept up. So, you know, it's a little hard to say whether we quote unquote lost money on each unit. I think in the end it balanced out.
But I think it's, you know, it's worth mentioning that what it looks like this model has done, and correct me if I'm wrong, is, you know, you manage to pay for some staff that are required to run the building that aren't directly on the shop floor. You are paying for part of your utilities and rent for the building. For all of the people who are actually making things, you were able to pay them when they may not otherwise have jobs and may need health insurance because, hey, it's the middle of a pandemic and it's kind of important for people to have health insurance right now, right? And you got to get to the point where some of the partners that you're working with can get their costs covered. And it looks like you had a very realistic, you know, like estimation of all of the different pieces, moving pieces that were involved in actually making this set of face shields. So I love this. I love this bill of materials. This is great.
So we also had our accountants, all the direct costs for this, and I know that a lot of smaller community space don't have, you know, a lot of accounting firepower. They might be doing it with volunteers or something, but we do have an accounting firm. So we coded all our expenses on this project under the label Makers Unite. And then we're able to go back and construct a profit and loss statement at the end of this, right? And so the results aren't fully in yet because we've been doing it up until a week ago. So I won't get the full results until July 1. But the preliminary was that, yes, it was break even. We came out, you know, $10,000 or $20,000 ahead, but we haven't bought all the rewards and paid out the partner costs and some of these things yet. So I think it'll come pretty close to zeroing out, which not that we have a crystal ball or anything, but we have had a lot of experience costing products in the past, and through some of our classes for members, you know, we've walked people through this process before, so we're able to drill into it pretty good.
And I do want to say, you know, while you're saying you're zeroing out costs, I think it's important for people here to realize that that also means there were contributions to your rent, there are contributions to your full-time staff payments, right? Like, it's not a true zeroing as some makers might understand that.
Right. So similar to our overall business model, we raised about as much money as we made from selling a face shield. So if we end up on 28,000 units, we ended up making about $175,000. And we raised roughly that much in donations. A small portion of that was crowdsourced online, but the majority of it came from the Baltimore philanthropic community and some businesses. And what that's done is OpenWorks is one of the larger makerspace in the United States, and full transparency, it costs between $100,000 and $120,000 a month to run the space. We are professionally staffed. We're open 7 days a week, 12 hours a day. We have a different operating model in a lot of spaces. So between the money we've raised, the costs we've cut, and the money we made from the face shields, we've positioned ourselves with some gas in the tank, because as we restart operations, we know already from our member survey that only a fraction of our members will be coming back, at least in the short term. All classes are canceled at least until the fall. And our contract work, we may be doing more of that, but supply costs have gone way up, etc. You know, that business model is in a lot of flux right now. All events have been canceled. So, you know, this is not to say that we've like, that we're over here like hoarding money. What we're trying to do is we very much see ourselves as a community resource and a center of community resilience. We have 55 small businesses that operate out of OpenWorks that are all don't have access to the equipment that they need to make money right now. We're going to need, it's almost like we're becoming a startup again, and we're going to need as much kind of working capital as we can get over the next quarter to kind of make that transition back into full sustainable operation where we were in March, right?
Yeah, and it sounds like you're thinking pretty deeply about what this transition looks like, you know, looking at, hey, yeah, classes are canceled, events are canceled, right? These are portions of our revenue stream that, you know, are what keep us open, right, in the first place. And making sure that you have that covered is a pretty big deal.
And then trying to have some capital to pivot some of that stuff online, onto a virtual space. So we've been applying for grants to put some of our classes on YouTube and Zoom. We're launching a virtual summer camp because we did 5 weeks of summer camp last week with young people from the neighborhood, and they're in need of education and outreach and support more than ever right now, especially if their parents are having to go back to work.
So I saw one question come up a couple different times. Can you speak to like the the requirements to sell products, like you talked about product liability insurance, you talked about, you know, other elements like sales tax that were used to actually sell products. For those spaces out there who have never sold before, you know, what kinds of things should they be looking at?
Right. So a couple of things. If you go to mdmakersunite.org, you can find copies of our volunteer waiver and a bunch of other information that has come up in the chat. We've tried to warehouse it all there. We have a product liability insurance policy. It exempts us from it. We're not allowed to make certain things under our policy. Number one being kids products or toys of any kind. Number two is regulated medical devices. So like it would not cover something like a ventilator. A face shield is not a regulated medical device. It's doesn't have to be sterile. There are various NIH, you know, FDA overlapping sets of requirements for one, but they're not like anybody can sell a face shield basically. So we stayed away from products that would be in a regulated environment. That policy costs about $10,000 a year, which is the cheapest of our several insurance policies. And basically it just means that, you know, if somebody gets sick while wearing our face shield and comes back and tries to sue us, that lawsuit will be fought by the insurance company and not by us, basically. Two, we made both purchasers and volunteers sign a waiver. So the purchasing waiver is not available in a Google Doc. You have to go to flattenthecurvebaltimore.com, which is the sales website. And you have to click through all the screens like you're going to buy one, and then it's an agreement that you click to. But that was a second layer that the lawyer for Innovation Works suggested as kind of insulating us from any pushback on the products. When we got into making face shields for the USDA, that became a different environment. So about 50% of the face shields we made were a custom design that clips into a hard hat that we came up with based on a set of specs that were sent to us for the meatpacking inspector workforce. So longer shield, it uses the Prusa bottom reinforcement, but other than that, it's all CNC cut parts out of HDP or acrylic. That one was a little bit more of a lift in terms of meeting regulatory requirements. We had to send them a couple prototypes. They had to be signed off by a set of leadership. And then once we kind of got the approval, we sent them out. We have received some, you know, complaints about that product. I'd say the error rate is still vanishingly small, but more so than we heard from the healthcare workers. And I think it's largely to do with the fact that people are wearing those in uncontrolled environments. You know, a hospital's air-conditioned space, a lot of complaints about fogging up. Well, you're in a high humidity, you know, environment. We can't really control some of that stuff with the type of plastics we were able to source.
Right. Question, so you talked about the importance of paying your fabricators. How else does OpenWorks balance its commitment to financial sustainability with your commitment to diversity and inclusion? How do those pieces?
That's a great question. One of the things we're super proud of at OpenWorks is that we are, by NOMCON's data, one of the most diverse makerspace in the country. So about 45% of our members are people of color, and over half of our staff is. A third of our managerial staff is, and our board is majority people of color. Baltimore City is 63% African American city. So a couple of steps we took. One is just the fact of paying people to do this. I mean, first and foremost, we're not asking people to put themselves at risk, come out of quarantine and all that without offering some financial compensation in a time of great uncertainty for everyone's wallet. Two, we ended up giving away about 5% of our face shields to local organizations that could not afford them, mostly food distribution sites. 2 weekends ago, we distributed about 500-600 face shields at the protests. Some of our staff took them out. Again, we stand with Black Lives Matter as a matter of policy, but whatever your politics are, it's a mass gathering of people, and our first concern is keeping people safe. So being able to hand it out to folks was a great way to kind of help protect folks. And then in terms of hiring back, we just put a form out to our furloughed employees and had people volunteer. A lot, well, not a lot, but a proportion of our employees have pre-existing health conditions or are older, which also speaks to the diversity of our staff. And so they couldn't come in and do this. So it did end up being kind of the younger, more able-bodied folks that ended up volunteering to come back.
Do you have advice for people here for where to look for grant money or opportunities like this, not just for production, but also for bringing your workshops back online and other things like that? Sounds like you've been pretty successful in securing a lot of government grants and community grants.
So we're lucky on a couple fronts, is that we've been doing this for a long time, and relatively long time. So we had some pre-existing relationships with funders, and I was kind of already in a fundraising cycle and already in conversation with some of our normal funders who are pivoting to emergency production. So my advice to anyone who ever asks that question is every city has a philanthropic community. Every city has a set of foundations that's focused on local granting. And that's always should be the first people that you talk to, because they're the ones that are really invested in wherever you live, whether it's Dubuque or Pittsburgh or, St. Louis Obispo, large, small, medium, every town has some folks with deep pockets. Two, Baltimore, a bunch of Baltimore foundations got together and put together an emergency COVID fund that did rolling applications over a 45-day window for nonprofits struggling with COVID shutdowns. So that proved to be a great place to find the money to do the video programming, which will start coming out in mid-July, because not all of our normal funders kind of saw that as important, I guess. So you might want to look in your local community if people are standing up these kind of emergency funds. And then last, we have never had great luck crowdsourcing donations, but we had good luck with it this time. We have a donation link on our website that's just been sitting there all this time. And then on Facebook, and between those two things, we were able to raise about $25,000. And that was mostly because we got some local media attention. So final piece of advice is you don't have to be, a kind of media hog, but if you're doing good work and helping people, it doesn't hurt to reach out to folks. We kind of backed into it by accident because it kind of took off on Facebook, and then someone from the local paper reached out to us and it went from there. But in your local town, reach out to a reporter, try to get a little attention for it, and you might be surprised at how many people start showing up on your website or just sending you a small check in the mail.
Yeah, and I want to add to that and just say, most cities, at least in the U.S., have offices of economic development. Most of them have at least a couple staff members who are trying to promote strengthening the local economy, local businesses. And I would personally encourage people to look for those folks in particular, those officials, because they are there to help promote growth within your city. And if you're coming to them saying, hey, I can locally produce things for other local businesses, they're the ones who can hook you up with potential links to those businesses, who can give you platforms and email lists and things like that to reach out on. They're the ones who are aware of funding abilities, right? They will know the Chamber of Commerce. They will know, who's granting, what the philanthropic organizations in the answer or in the area are. So I'd strongly encourage, folks here, if you don't have ties to the Office of Economic Development or its equivalent in your local city, they're a great place to go to make these sorts of connections.
To use Maryland as an example, the two that we linked up with were the Baltimore Development Corporation, which usually focuses on real estate in Baltimore, but it's a quasi-public entity that buys, sells, and holds real estate for the city, but also does economic development. They were giving out grants for capital purchases for PPE production. So we were able to secure a small grant to offset the cost of a new laser cutter to increase our production capacity. And then the Maryland Manufacturing Extension Partnership, a version of this exists in every state.
Yep.
They didn't give out money, but what they did do is they set up a clearinghouse website for everyone making COVID-related anything from hand sanitizer to masks to whatever. And it's sort of a matching program. So now my inbox, like I get these inquiries that are forwarded to me from that website. Like, I'm looking for X, Y, or Z. Can you make it for me? And not all those have panned out, but it's a great way to offload some of the work of kind of marketing yourself to someone that's centralizing the information.
Yep. Well, we're about 3 minutes past, and I want to thank you very much, Will, for taking the time to talk to us and share your information. If anybody else has any final questions that are quick, you might be able to take them. But.
Yeah, and feel free to email me. I dropped my email in the chat, where you can find it on our website. If you have any follow-up questions, I'm happy to try and help. And thank you so much for inviting us on. So grateful to represent our space and our efforts.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody. Have a good one.